Okay. Yeah. Good eye, Mike. I think they're ready to go. I think we'll get started. Chat open. Hey, Mike, welcome. Yeah, she's just sitting in. I got this. Can I give you a call out in the beginning? Sounds good. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the AI Preferences Working Group. And if you can close the door behind you when you come in, greatly appreciate it. Thank you. As you may or may not notice, like my co-chair, Mark, is out sick, and Tommy is standing in for Mark today to help me with the chairing stuff. And like Mark should be fine soon. It's just he's here locally. And we'll just get kicked off. Like most of it is discussions today. So we circulated an agenda before. And really the idea is to like make some solid progress towards our interim meeting where we're gonna have much more detailed discussion of stuff. But here we kind of want to work on the high level questions and then go into like some logistics for like how we go about with the drafts, what are the things we want to work on, and then like set the path for Brussels. I was going to call next slide, but I realize it's me who has to do it. And please look at the Notewell slide. If you have, this is not the first meeting today. In this meeting, you've seen this many times, but it's important that you look at it, like what constitutes as a contribution and everything. So there's a lot of RFCs you can look at because I don't want to summarize them wrongly. And so please follow the code of conduct. Please be professional to people. This is like a contentious topic and people have differing opinions, but please be professional and polite with people. Follow the code of conduct. And you've seen the tools. So there's like meeting tips. If you go to the agenda, you can follow the on-site tool. So if you're going to come to the mic, greatly appreciate that you put yourself in the mic line so the other people know who's speaking at some point, because people do try to come in and we cannot sequence the people without getting on the mic line. And we have a fairly relaxed agenda. We can kind of play with the time. We had some suggested times on the agenda, but we can play with it a little bit based on how discussions are going to go. And there was an intentional decision that Mark and I made to not put the drafts up front. Usually like a working group put the drafts for adoption up front, but we kind of wanted to have the big higher level question discussion before looking at the drafts because we didn't want to get sidetracked on some technicalities. So the agenda is like this way for a specific reason. And I just wanted to do two things. Like, first of all, thanks to our AD, Zahed, who chartered this group. And we do have a new AD who's taken over yesterday, the group. So hello, Mike. You want to come say to the mic and say something?
Not a whole lot to say. I'm happy to contribute to this, and I'm curious to see where it goes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. And so we'll just go over the charter for the people who are not following this very closely. So just talk about like what's in scope, what's not in scope. You can obviously get this from the charter page, but with a short reminder. And then we sent a list of questions to the group, like, what are the things we want to answer, like to with the group going forward. So like most of the time of today's session is probably going to be answering those questions or discussing those questions. We probably won't get all the answers, but the idea is to discuss those questions in the meeting today. And we do have some candidate drafts. We started collecting them in the document section of the working group. There's a link here, but you can also go to our working group page and look at the documents. You're going to see the same list, but just in case you want to follow the link, it's easier. And talk about the interim a little bit at the end. So what's in the charter, right? Like, so we have like three primary deliverables. I would say 3 deliverables. Like one of them is really a vocabulary for expressing the preferences for AI. And this is independent from how these are going to get associated to the content. So that's like the first one. The second one is like, how do we attach this to IETF defined protocols and formats? And we do have some examples in there, but they're not exhaustive. You can actually have probably more things or like not work on all of these things, but the idea is to kind of put in some kind of guidelines as to what we're looking at a high level. And the final one is probably going to be like the most difficult one, I would think, is that how do you reconcile multiple expressions of preferences, right? Like, because there's multiple people probably in a chain who can do it in multiple places where this can be done. How do we actually do this in a consistent way? And or how do we actually even get to a point where we can specify how these are going to get combined? And the out of scope things were like pretty clear, like when we had the workshop and kind of carried over all these things. So the technical enforcement of this is out of scope. The the authenticating the crawlers and clients is out of scope, but we did have a bot authentication side meeting, so that's not in this working group, but it's probably something that can happen in the IETF, but it's not. It's specifically ruled out of scope in the charter here. And establishment of any kind of registries is out of scope, and auditing and transparency measures are out of scope for the working group. That doesn't mean like you cannot work on it, like we don't want to spend the working group time to start off with on it, like, but if you kind of go away as a group, there's like some kind of topics like that we talked about. If you want to go away, work on a group and bring the results to the working group, or like bring your findings, feel free to do so, but like that's probably not what you're going to do primarily in the group. So any questions till now? There is, if you can kind of take notes, like, in a collaborative fashion, I posted a link onto the chat. If you can kind of take notes, like not looking for a specific note taker, but if you want to put something in there, like if you think some idea has to be captured or you wanted to say something, it's like not totally clear, like just make sure that you put something in the notes there, and we'll kind of collect it into the minutes for the meeting and make sure it's communicated. Jonathan, I saw your comment. I don't know, if you're in the room, you can make the comment here.
I mean, I don't really know that it makes sense at the mic, given that we've charted, but I think ruling bot auth N and Z out of scope doesn't make a lot of sense because it informs everything else. And if you don't know what guarantees you're going to get, then describing the language of what you're going to express. Yeah.
So to answer that, right? Like, so I think Mark would have a better answer for this, but like one thing we have is like time pressure. So there's a lot of regulatory action happening in this space. So we want to get to something sooner than later. So we're not trying to like do all those things. Like just because it's out of charter now doesn't mean it cannot come into charter, but there is some stuff we need to do it. And it's a finite amount of cycles that we have in the working group. And if we go on this, which is probably like a more contentious topic, we're going to get like pulled down on the other things, right? That's kind of the goal. So it's not really like, hey, this is not something we want to solve. It's like something we didn't want to solve first. So there's like quite a bit of, it was a contentious thing, but it did stay out of scope. David?
David's going to just respond to Jonathan. I think the specific bit about out of scope is not designing that here, but we can assume that it exists. We can write in these documents, if the crawler is known to be X or Y, we could discuss them. We're just not designing the mechanisms for it, which is a much more kind of low level, that TLSE thing.
But we do need to say what the guarantees we're expecting are, right? It's like if we're saying, oh, we know this is a particular AI, that's one thing. If we're saying we know it's something from the internet, that's a totally different.
The word trusted in a hand-waving emoji.
Yeah, Kulevina actually came to the mic to disagree with you. I think there is a value in stating a preference, and then those who want to adhere to the preference can act on it. And that already creates a value. And let's concentrate on that piece first. And that's completely independent of the questions if somebody will act on it and who will act on it for now. Because that's kind of the easy bit, and it's really, really, really needed, and that will already get us to a point where we're much better than where we're now.
Thanks, Mirya. Martin, did you want to make your comment at the mic as well? Lucas, go ahead.
Yeah, it kind of probably echoes what Miriam said. Like, we have lots of examples in HTTP land, for example, of sending hints to a peer that we would really like them to follow because we think it would be better for us or for them, but they're kind of free to ignore that. And there might be implementation details about what you do in response to them ignoring it, or how you could get a stronger assertion about what hints you give them based on some proof of a thing or not, and some trust or not. But I think it's right to ignore that aspect. Like, define what the hint is and the format of this thing, and that's probably not going to change much, and it's valuable right now. And then the other bits that Jonathan talked about could be done in parallel. They'll probably change in the future as we get more and more implementation experience with this thing. But like, a data format is fairly straightforward to do. So let's just crack on. Like, it's in the charter. Let's just do what the charter said. I don't want to relitigate it.
Thanks, Lucas.
Yes.
Martin?
So my position is that the statements that we're talking about are at least as public as the content itself. That's a reasonable way to put this. And so for content that is publicly available, any assertions that someone might make about their preferences regarding how that's used is equally public, and we don't need anything special there. There's a completely orthogonal space in which we might consider the example of using access control to the content as part of having a technical enforcement about preferences, so that you cannot obtain this content, therefore you cannot use it. But that's a completely different solution space that we're talking about. We are talking about stuff that's widely available on the web that people have preferences regarding because they want to distinguish between uses, not how it's obtained. I want to point out also that there's another authorization discussion that we might have, which is about determining who is authorized to make claims about content. And that's another one that I think is in the questions. And we should keep those separate as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Okay, so one of the things we talked about, the scope of the vocabulary, is like, we want something relatively simple and something that's extensible, right? Like, instead of trying to shoot for perfection on day one, like, we just want to talk about, like, whether this is the direction the work group wants to go, because a lot of these things are like stuff that we got from the workshop, and it's a much smaller audience, and it's like more close than this, right? Like, now it's like we are bringing this into the open in the IETF. Can we continue to agree that this is the general principle, that we want to kind of keep it like fairly simple to start off with extension points for stuff? So all of these things are like really open mic stuff, so just come up. We just want to hear from people, so we can kind of like focus on what we need to do at the interim to follow those directions. Glenn, are you in the room? Yeah.
Yes, I'm not Mark. I am in the room. Hey, did we resolve, have we decided on the opt-in versus opt-out structure? Because I raised that on the list and there was some discussion about it, but I think that it's something of interest.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's worth having some time on that one if it's not already in the questions. I don't think it was from recollection. So maybe we can set some time aside for that one. I wanted to address this question. I think that this is a great principle. I think it's consistent with a lot of the work that people have already done in this area. The IPTC, or I forget the specific name of the extension, the PLUS work has a relatively small set of things that people can do. The paper that Open Future and Paul put together on this one has an extremely small set of things that you can talk about. And I think that's good in this context, because we need something sooner, and the smaller it is, the sooner we can have it.
Sounds good. Alyssa, did you want to talk a little bit more about it? Like, are you concerned like that we don't have a strong delineation of what relatively means? If you can talk, thanks.
Yes, I am concerned about that.
Okay. So where do you think we should draw the line?
I I suspect it's not really possible to have that conversation in the abstract
Mm-hmm,
the way that this question wants it to.
mm-hmm.
So I guess it's more just a flag. Like, it's not obvious to me that everyone's what they have in their mind when they think of something simple is necessarily the same. Probably like we can all sort of agree on things that are very complicated and have like, multi-layered semantics and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the other end of the spectrum, I suspect different people have different things in their mind.
Okay,
So that's all. I just wanted to flag. I think this is like fine at a principal level, but when we, in the next step, when we start actually talking about different possible versions of the vocabulary, I think we'll see these disagreements straight away.
okay, so I'll tell you like what Mark and I were thinking about, like when we like put that down, right? The idea is like, if you're not sure that like whether this is part of the simple vocabulary set, it's out, right? Like by default, that's kind of at least the thinking, that if you cannot agree positively that it's part of the simplest thing we had to do, it's probably out. Like, because like otherwise we would be spending a lot of time trying to discuss things that are potentially complex or not. Does that make sense?
I mean, again, like in principle, it makes sense, but in practice, I suspect that quote unquote, the simplest set, like what some people think of that will differ from others. Like, and I think a lot, so one axis on which this will rear its head is like that the sort of search AI distinction is not strict, but rather a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And some people will want more aspects of that teased out or less. And then the other one, just since I have the mic, is the additional axes, like non-commercial versus commercial use. There's a few more of those. Some people are probably going to argue for like those being very important, and other people are going to say, no, let's just do TDM search AI, get on with it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all. I don't think we need. I think it'll just be easier once we start talking about the actual details. So I'm fine with the principle, but the devil's going to be in the details.
Yeah, sounds good. And I think your point is pretty clear, Alyssa, right? Like, so I think when we go to the candidate documents discussion, I think we can have that discussion to see like, where we probably will have a starting point or not, right? Like, I think that could probably help there, but I suspect we won't resolve it today, right? But at least I think your point is like, what is the simplest set is something that's up for discussion, makes a lot of sense, but yeah, thank you. I accept that it's not fully actionable because people might have different views of what that is. Thank you.
Mia Kulewind here. I think what's important to consider here is that there's two sides. There's somebody who wants to express a preference, but then there's also the other side consuming this information and has to do something with it. And there's a certain expectation from the person expressing the preference, like what action to follow. And it only makes sense to express things that have actually actionable things that somebody can act on and that is distinguishable, right? If the action that follows from the preference I express is the same action in all cases, I don't need to distinguish. And I think we haven't been, and I know this is also not an easy question because there's one entity that does the crawling and then creates a data set, and then the data set is used in one way, and then you have the training data, and then the AI model is used in another way, and so on. So this is not easy. That's why we're here. But we need to consider this as well. What is the action that can follow based on the information if you get this information, and is that the action that is also expected by the person expressing the information?
Mm-hmm. But I think like we have people from like almost all of these communities, if not all of the communities, like potentially involved in this. So I would assume they would speak up, right? If like their needs are not being met.
I hope so, but I actually feel like we have less people speaking up from that part of the community. And like the point really is, if you express something that is not actionable, it's not valuable. Even so, I know you have this preference, but if there's nothing you can, the person getting this preference can do with this information, it's not useful.
Perfect, thank you. So anything more on this before I move to the next question? Okay, Martin is giving me the WebEx rabbit icon. Glenn, did you want to make?
Yeah, I had one more comment, and it was related to what you just said about community. I think it's a really good observation. We have I think we should also recognize we have a lot of people coming into this conversation that are not used to the IETF process or the way we do things here. And so they're still getting up to speed. So as we start making some decisions and move things forward, figuring a way to get them included in that conversation is going to be really key to getting a final consensus. So just a comment.
Sounds good. Thank you. Glenn, if your point is like probably the chair should like also spend some time like talking to people who we don't think we heard from. Yeah, thank you. 1 minute. Okay, so we talked about like attachment by location, and one of the things is like, hey, are we going to like start with like reusing robots.txt, right? Like, and that seems to be like the direction that like, seems pretty plausible. And if you think there's any technical or operational deficiencies like in doing so, either speak up now, like, or like start a thread, but that's something we want to kind of resolve quickly. Glenn, were you online for this or? Okay.
Sorry, the app is a little bit slow when we connect.
Okay, Gary.
Well, hello.
Please don't say you have concerns with this.
I have concerns of this. So, what was that? 10 minutes ago, we were chatting with Martin. And I think robots.txt on its own is not enough. And I think that word should be replaced with robots exclusion protocol.
Sounds good. Like it's further down.
Because Martin doesn't like it. Because we heard publishers, even in DC, that they want URL level controls. Robots.txt can do it, but it has a size limit. It's a technical limit.
Mm-hmm.
If you are CNN, for example, or Wall Street Journal or Fox News, then you probably have millions of URLs, and you are going to run into those technical problems, even if you are doing pattern stuff. But if you can do URL level, for example, HTTP headers, which Martin likes very much, then that's much better for them.
Sounds good. Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, I think robots.txt is where all the bots are going to be looking in a lot of cases. And so it would be foolish of us to just say, oh, we need a new thing entirely to tell them what to do, because that's where they're looking. And as much as I don't like robots.txt for a number of reasons, that's where they are. And so if we don't go there, that's just a missed opportunity of the bigger sort. The same thing applies to HTTP headers. Gary's point is like spot on. You can't put your entire site on in a robots.txt file in a lot of cases, and nor would you necessarily want to. And so having something in HTTP headers is we'll have to argue about how, I think, which is why the sort of just saying robots exclusion protocol is something that I think we need to talk about once we get to specific proposals.
Sounds good.
Not in the abstract.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so another thing that kind of came up quite a bit is like, Jean-François, sorry.
Yes. Sorry, I'm not at all an expert in robot.txt. I don't even know the whole form and everything. I was just listening to the conversation. I was wondering, since you're pointing out that all the robots are going to be, all the agents are going to be looking into it, would it be possible? So my assumption is, if most of the industry is looking at a particular file, they might be updating the agents for whatever modifications may come in the format of that file. So would it be possible to use that to incorporate a new command, a new reference that basically forwards you to another document or to whatever solution we want to implement, and use that as the bypass, specifically for what you want to do, so that you don't bloat the robots.txt and you just leverage on the fact that everyone is going to be looking like as the first. Just wondering, it's really not my area.
It's certainly possible. The question is whether that provides us with any advantage.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, how that is enforced, that's another story. I'm just wondering if that's a trigger we can use.
Thank you. Another thing we discussed in detail is like whether we should like do either opt-in or opt-out or both. And part of it is like, there's going to be regulatory regimes which are going to go for one or the other. So the suggestion was like we kind of like allow both of these things to happen. Does anybody have concerns with that? Glenn?
You have to open the phone, you have to unlock the phone, you have to reconnect to the website, then you have to push the button. It takes a second. So having designed some protocols or some grammars in the past, there are lessons learned that grammars for opting in and grammars for opting out can have some distinct differences in the way you express things. It's an interesting idea of do both. I think it's going to be difficult to create a consistent grammar that allows you to do both and make sense, but I may be proven wrong. I respect gentleman here is shaking his head going, nah, but my observation.
Thank you. David Skenazy.
Hi, David. Are you an AIPREF enthusiast?
No, I couldn't come up with a good one this time. I'm sorry. I'm definitely not an AI enthusiast. So to me, opt-in means if you don't do anything, then the result is false. No, like you don't do. And opt-out means if you don't do anything, the result is yes. If we do both opt-in and opt-out, and you say nothing, the result is what? What does this mean?
No, we don't do both. We support like both of them to be made possible, right?
Okay.
Like so.
Sounds good. Yeah.
So I think to Glenn's question, this is relatively straightforward. You can have a signal that is either absent, an opt-in, or an opt-out, and you just have to provide for the three states. I think that in terms of the expression of preferences, that's relatively straightforward. The complicated bit is depending on which set of rules you're operating under as the user of this content, your actual determination process for working out whether or not something is okay or not according to laws and preferences and all those sorts of other things gets really complicated, but the preference is relatively straightforward. It's just, I'm not expressing any opinion about this, or I would like to opt in where opt-in is necessary, or I would like to opt out where opt-out is an option. And those are the three modes that we would be able to signal. The real question for me is about what things you might want to express those preferences.
Right, and Martin, like to your point, right? Like the absence of the signal is a problem case, right? Based on like, like when there's no signal, like, you don't know what people are going to do with it.
I think a very important thing to recognize is that there's a lot of content apparently already, and none of that has a preference according to whatever it is that we'll be specifying.
Thanks.
Well, yeah,
Richard.
this is Richard Barnes. Like, nothing this working group does is going to address the entirety of existing content on the internet. Like, that is inherently going to be an ambiguous situation. So yeah, I just think you just say basically what Martin was saying. Martha's my wife. I always do what she says. I was just going to underscore the point here that this needs to be turned. This is not like this dichotomy you have on the slide is false. Like the dominant case is going to be, I don't know. And we should allow folks to express exclusive things, inclusive things. But we need to have that baseline of, I don't know.
But just Barnes, like, do you think that's a regulatory thing to specify the absence of thing or something that we have to do? Like in the absence of a signal, like what we do with it is probably something outside the scope of this to determine.
No,
right?
no, I don't think. I'm trying to decide like what you would write that would constrain what someone does in the absence.
We wouldn't. That's the point. Like we wouldn't, right? Like, but the question is like, can we assume a default opt-in mode or opt-out mode, or like we should design for both of them? That's the point.
Like the default has to be like whatever the status quo is right now.
Exactly.
Okay. So and this working group can specify a way for the content owner or the controller, whatever we're calling it, to express preferences with regard to the content, but that's a statement that is in addition to whatever the baseline is in the universe.
Thank you.
Okay, so roughly what we want is, I would phrase this as an allow list and a deny list rather than opt-in or out, and that becomes way clearer if I'm understanding right.
Okay. Thank you. Glenn?
I just
I
wanted
think,
to respond.
is there a quick response that you have, or otherwise, like, I'll take you after after we get to Alyssa?
It's very quick.
Okay.
I just wanted to push back on the issue that we have to sort of start with the baseline of what we have now and move forward, because we don't have anything for AI stuff. So we're really at ground zero.
I think the point was really like most of the content is not tagged with anything, right? Like that's a fact. Like it's not something we have to debate. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, thanks. Alyssa?
So I think it's worth basically writing down what Richard said and whatever the chairs are going to do with this, because I think to Glenn's earlier point, there are lots of people coming into this work fresh, and I know it might seem obvious to some people, but to just be clear, like we are not aiming to affect the norm that exists in any particular place in the absence of a signal being expressed or a preference being expressed. Like, I think some people think that is possible here, and I don't think it's possible, and it sounds like nobody else in the queue does either. But I think that's actually important to just like put it someplace so that the next time it comes up and the next new person who walks in who hasn't been part of the conversation, we can refer them back to this is what the working group decided at the beginning. It's not exactly a requirement, but it's more like this is our understanding of the universe today. Like let's write it down.
Sounds
Yeah,
good.
and just to phrase that a little bit differently, the two alternatives that are on the slide here. Opt-in has an implication that the default is excluded, and you opt in, and the opt-out implies the default is included and you opt out. Whereas the default in actuality is, I don't know. And we are creating any policy in this document.
Sounds good. Thank you. So let's call this like Richard Barnes's first principle of default exclusion or something like that. So if you can send the text, Richard. Yeah, sounds good. Barnes's uncertainty principle. Thank you. Thanks. Richard, like, did you want to get in line again, or was it for this? Okay, thanks. Gary.
So I will preface this that I don't necessarily like what I'm going to say, but I will say it anyway. For the past 35 years, the internet was a free-for-all for everyone. And it was designed such to be like freely accessible to everyone. And if we are going to change that, or someone wants to change that, that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. Because there are very big players in that space.
Sounds good. Thank you. Glenn. Did you already state what you wanted to state?
Yeah, I already said it.
Okay. Thank you. Lucas?
Hey, yeah, so it's kind of late for me. My mind's wandering, and this is probably a stupid point, but like, there's cases I'm familiar with in like UK where organizations or companies try and get individuals to sign contracts that make them lose their rights to certain things, and those contracts are not actually allowed. Like, you're not allowed to give up your right to X, right? Even if you sign that contract, it's null and void. So when we're having language about opting in and out, I just wonder what that relates to. Are you actually even able to do that? Maybe that's not a question we need to answer right now. Or maybe it's a question that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, it just crossed my mind as we're talking through this topic.
So while I hear you, Lucas, right? Like, I think we are talking about what the absence of the signal means. And I think like what Richard was clarifying was like, it means whatever existed before, if I can paraphrase this, right? So is there something you disagree with on that? I think Tommy has something to say.
At least how I was interpreting Lucas's point, which I heard expressed earlier as well, is that right, we're agreeing that the absence of a signal and the absence of a preference means you have this unknowable status quo that has all of these complex realities. The preference itself also is going to exist within a context, and the other laws and regulations. So there may be some context in which that preference being expressed is unenforceable, or people are stating that that is not a valid thing to be able to give up. This is merely an expression of a preference that always exists within a broader context that is beyond the scope of what we do here.
Yeah, sounds good. And I think we do have a separate question about like the regulatory stuff that comes in later, that probably in that space, the policymaker space rather than in the space. So yeah. Okay, so we just started to do attachment mechanism, but not just for location, but also for embedded metadata. So we did hear a few things like HTTP header fields, I think Martin's favorite or Martha's favorite, like is one of them. And JSON formats, like, and is there anything else that we are missing out? Like, can we agree on what are the things we want to work on in the group? Is there something you see here that you don't want to work on, or something that you don't see here that you think we should work on? Thomas?
Hi, Thomas Howe, VCon enthusiast. We are looking at the VCon group to take the same vocabulary and use it to describe the consent that we attach to the recordings. So that's an example of a data format.
Perfect. Can you put that in the notes as well, like, and so we can.
Sure will. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Glenn?
Heather, I keep realizing I keep missing saying Glenn Dean, Comcast, NBC Universal. In this question, can you give me some clarification? I'm not so much worried about the formats, but the mechanisms that would allow for cryptographic binding, or like signing, something strong binding of the expression to the material. Is that in scope? Is that not in scope? It's something we're going to work on. What's the thinking?
There is, okay. Martin, do you want to say something? Because I do have to.
You can answer it if you like.
No, go for it.
Okay. I think we absolutely should not do anything like cryptographic binding or tying it to authorization or what have you. There's been a bit of a discussion on the list about this question. I think if your goal was to ensure that we didn't finish, then that would be a good path to follow.
I mean,
this sort of thing is
there's ranges here, though, right?
complicated.
There's simple things like, at a very simple level, there is expression in the policy grammar where you might express a signed identifier of the thing you're referring to, right? That's simple. That's something we do without taking forever to accomplish, because that kind of stuff already exists. So that's why I'm trying to sort of understand the scope here before we start proposing things of, are we going to try to tackle that even if we try to simplify it, or are we going to rule it completely out of scope and not do it at all?
I think if you want to put that in scope, I would still concentrate on delivering something without that beforehand. The questions you have to answer in order to build something around authorization of these things is incredibly difficult, in the sense that you need to have an understanding of what expectations are amongst both those producing the content and those consuming it, and reaching some sort of common agreement about things like identity and who's able to control various pieces of content and say things about it is fraught. And so I would very much prefer that we do the absolute simplest thing and ship that, and then we can talk about doing the complicated things. I know you probably may be referring to some of the signing stuff that's in CTPA that has an unspecified trust architecture. I wasn't able to get any more detail than unspecified out of that one. The signatures exist. I can sign anything with any odd keys. The real challenge in that work is building up the trust infrastructure and the identity infrastructure that needs to be tied into those things.
Absolutely agree on the CGPA stuff. That is an open question with them. And that's why I didn't bring them up in the thing I mentioned. So how about this? I'm going to take away that it's not explicitly excluded, but we are wary of the complications. And if a proposal could come up, we might consider it.
Right, like, and I think Alyssa made a good point on the chat. I just want to make sure like the word soon is doing a lot of this work. The idea is like, what do we start on first? Like, it's not like excluding anything at this point, because like we do have to make some progress quickly. So if you can kind of figure out what are the short list of things we want to start working on soon, I think that's the goal of this question rather than to, yeah, scope something.
That helps, thanks.
Thank you.
So I got into line to answer the question specifically. I think Gary mentioned HTTP header fields. I think we need to make sure that wherever content goes, there's a relatively easy way to be able to attach preferences to it. And robots.txt is obviously an easy place to attach it to everything that sits on a web server in most cases. HTTP header fields is a great way to attach it to a very commonly used form of delivery. The vCon example was a great one. I wouldn't necessarily want to do that work here. I would expect that any vCon work could happen in another group based on the definitions that we come up with here. That would be great. And the same is true for a lot of things. I would prefer we concentrate on the things that have massive impact within this group. And I think JSON formats is like which JSON formats, which immediately leads me to conclude that anyone defining a JSON format may choose to integrate this work. But probably in a lot of cases, JSON is going over HTTP, so it may be sensible to just use HTTP in that case and robots.txt again. So for the most part, I think we should just concentrate on identifying those few places where we can have the most impact and that fall within the purview of the IETF. I think an example of something that would be very, very impactful would be the IPTC metadata on JPEGs, for instance. We're not going to do that work. 100%. Right? We can't. But it would have a huge impact if someone did it. So if we can work with the folks over there to have that happen, that would be a great thing, but we're not going to do it here.
Sounds good. And that's something we have a question for Martin, right? Like, what organizations we need to work with. So this kind of connected to this, but it's not exactly the same question, right? So if you want to put something in some other organization's format, like we probably have to work with them. So that's a question that's coming up later. Thanks. Mirya or Dapeng? Dapeng, I don't know. Yeah.
So one question is that it seems that we limited our scope to only metadata in IETF controlled protocols. So do we also consider to liaison with other SDOs to make this specification easier for them to use?
So let me skip ahead because it's come up a couple of times. So like, I think this is something we do say, like, we do have to work with other organizations, either it's a liaison or not. Like the idea is if you think there's some things that we need to do, like, please bring it up, because sometimes Miriam might talk to this point, but sometimes the organization might need a formal liaison and we may not have one. I think it'll be good if you think of an organization that's relevant for this and we don't have a liaison relationship with them and we need it, we'd rather get started on it just in case and set that up, even though we may or may not need it. That's kind of the idea of this call out, right? Like, but as like Martin said, I think the intent is certainly like not to do like stuff in other people's formats, but just make sure they know that we are doing this so they can do it in their formats. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dapeng.
Mia Kulevin. I think it's not very helpful to have the discussion in the abstract here. Like if we want something, somebody has to do the work and start working on it. And then that's the point of time where you write a draft. And that's the point of time where you can decide, do we want to do it here and now? And that's the point of time where we can understand what the need of that person is that has decided to put the resources into it and write a draft. And the same, and keep that in mind, that's important. The same is true for other organizations. We can tell the other organization, we think this is useful for you, but like if nobody is willing to do the work there, it won't happen, right? So that's when we need to have the discussion. If people actually come here and say, I need this, I want this, and I've written this down. And I think this is also a little bit true for the binding and authentication part. I don't think that's useful to have the discussion in the abstract. It really depends on the protocol. If there's already some kind of binding and authentication, maybe it's useful to use it. If we have to invent a whole new set of protocols and trust architecture, that doesn't seem to be in scope for this work. But otherwise, it really depends on the protocol about what we do there, and we should have the discussion on each of these proposals separately.
Perfect, thank you. Colin.
Hi, Colin Perkins. I was going to bring up the issue of HTML, but that was sort of largely covered. I guess the follow-on question is, are we expecting to define a single grammar that can be used in all of these formats, as well as the metadata we can standardize? And if so, are we defining an abstract grammar, or are we trying to be specific in something that can directly be put into all of the formats? Because there's going to be an awful lot of constraints if we're trying to have a single format that's useful everywhere, whereas a single abstract format with concrete syntaxes for different approaches seems perhaps more achievable.
Thanks, Colin. Gary, like, are you going to address that point? Yeah.
Tying together Martin's and Colin's point. So when we wrote up, Gary wrote up the robots exclusion protocol preference extension or whatever, then I switched the values of the formerly xrobots tag to structured values, which means that we have a dictionary and then we have lots of sub values in the dictionary, and then that can be ported anywhere where we want it. Like, for example, if we wanted to have a new field in IPTC, then technically we could have it. Like, if someone liaises with them, then technically we could have that inside IPTC. The problem would be that it will be not abstract, but obviously structured in a very particular way. So might be difficult to convince everyone that this is the format that needs to go in the other protocols, but it's not something that we haven't done before. So
to paraphrase you, Gary, this will be like not abstract, but concrete, but with extensibility points. Okay. Okay. Jean-Francois?
Yes, sorry. Going back to the liaisons thing, I was just looking at the list and I see that there's one person who liaises with ITUT in general, and then you have 2 people for 2 of the study groups, 12 and 15. By my knowledge, because I'm participating in SG17, so there is a lot of conversation going on topics that could be overlapping with this. So I would recommend the IETF to figure out a liaison for that particular study group.
Sounds good.
And very, very likely you will also want to look into SG13 feature networks, which are definitely also having these kind of conversations, although I'm a little bit less acquainted with them.
So sounds good. Like, so I'll answer it, and maybe Miria will want to add something. So what we do is we have a high level relationship with ITT, just as you saw, like that's like Scott. And for the study groups itself, right, we kind of do it based on activity. Like when activity ramps up and down, like we kind of have those other relationships or not. So if there's like work to be done, we can certainly pull somebody in for those groups, but kind of has to be somebody who's also doing work there. Like I think a lot of the work gets done by this informal collaboration that common participants have. So if we can find somebody in there and who will also take part in that work, like please talk to Miria and me and Chin, who's in the room, like so we can.
You can always ask Arnaud, but you're just going to give him even more work being the SG17 chair. And on top of that, having to liaise with the IETF, he's probably going to be running crazy about his agenda. But I'm just recommending if you have anyone who can go over there, it would probably make a lot of sense.
I mean, I encourage people to really participate in both groups. That's the best way to do it. But I want to clarify that the reason why we have separate liaisons for 12 and 13 is because Scott asked us, he needs some support specifically for these groups.
Right.
But he is very active in other groups. I think he's actually very active in 13. So it doesn't mean that we're not covering 13. It just means like we have some additional people for the other groups, and then Scott is caring as much as he can about groups. So yeah, I think that one, 13 is, 17 is actually well covered. 13 is probably also something Scott participates in.
Yeah, so that's what I was mentioning, that seeing that you have people for specific study groups, it may help to us, again, divide the workload so that you have someone who's looking into it. If Scott is looking into it, it's totally fine.
I would double check with Scott, but I think this just means Scott is looking into it if it doesn't have a separate person.
Thanks.
And Jean-François, I just want to ask if you could also, go into the notes and just make sure that the very specific suggestions you have are taken down there, just so we can be sure to follow up correctly.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. And if you have any other organizations you can think of, either now where you can put on the notes or like come up and speak or send it on the list whenever you think of something, please. Thank you. And just give us a heads up, even if it's potentially relevant, just give us a heads up. Thanks. Okay, now to the elephant in the room. Like since we are in Thailand.
Hey,
elephant.
sorry, can I just jump in really quick on the last one before you move on?
Sure, thank you.
I think maybe just like a question for Leonard, who's not here. You know, often we get these liaison statements from other SDOs that's like, this work is kicking off. And that's all the liaison statement says. And I think it would be useful to understand from him for those like the ISO groups, or maybe people in the room already know, but like, would that type of thing be useful? Not that we need a formal liaison, but a statement that gets the attention of the people in those groups so that they are aware of the work in whatever way they're used to being informed. It might be good to check with him about whether we should do that.
Sounds good, Alyssa. I think we can check, and I think we can send this off. Like we just did this for Green working group that got started off. So we send this unsolicited, hey, we are starting this work that could be relevant to you. So we don't send that very frequently, but I think this is probably a case where that's warranted, where we can like send this to a larger set of organizations just to inform them in case they have further interest. So thank you. Okay, so heading to combining preferences. And I think like it's clear pretty much to everybody that this is going to be the probably the most complex deliverable we have, and it's probably going to be contentious. And the goal is like, you know, we kind of want to start work on this pretty quickly in case like, so we want to finish and also work on a set of examples to kind of drive this along, make sure like people understand how these things combine. Does anybody have any concerns or questions regarding this or any points to make? Because I think it's fairly important that we get a lot of input on this. Farzaneh, like I think like we are chartered to deliver something in August this year. So it's fairly aggressive. And Mike is like looking very surprised, like, you know, if I had to send an emoji, it's a surprise Pikachu face, but that's the time that's put on, that we have something to go. And it's fairly aggressive, but the part of the issue was that the timelines are pretty aggressive on the regulatory front, policymaker front. And the worry is, right, if you don't have something suboptimal or like not useful could get adopted. So we rather have something to put up as like a basis for a solution or toolbox for them. So that's kind of the goal. Okay. Farzaneh, go for it.
Yes. So, hi, Suresh and everybody. I'm just wondering, I'm a little bit confused about the timeline. Are we going to, I had the impression that we are going to do something a feasible, but on a vocabulary and kind of like standardized vocabulary by August and discuss the more thorny issues as we move on. So I thought that August timeline was just for a vocabulary, and I might be mistaken, but if I'm mistaken, can I push for having the vocabulary by August timeline?
Yeah, it's two of the deliverables, Farzaneh. So it's a vocabulary and attachment are both scheduled for August, not just vocabulary.
Okay. Yeah, so is it possible to do this work in parallel and get an extension for the combining preferences while we get the vocabulary work done?
I think so. So the suggestion here, right, is that we start on this, even though, like, you know, so instead of waiting till August to start on this, is kind of the suggestion, right? Because it's going to be something complex. Like, so let's get started on this sooner or later. Like, do you have a concern with that, Farzaneh, or like?
No, I think that we should do it in parallel, but deciding and agreeing on a few issues that will come up on combining preferences, as you mentioned, is going to be a little difficult. So I don't think this work should delay getting something out of the door about vocabulary. Just a word of caution. Happy to discuss.
Thanks. Yari? Oh, actually, yeah, go ahead. Sarah, go.
So I had a question about clarifying the piece on combining preferences, in particular the piece about kind of separate repositories or found elsewhere and correlated, because I think there's two elements to combining preferences. There's a space whereby you have kind of multiple expressions of preferences, one for a metadata, one for at the kind of site level, and that those are necessarily in conflict, versus something where it's like you have a replication of a piece of content on another site, and then there are someone saying it's fine to scrape this, and then the original kind of person who produced it says the opposite. I would say that the latter is just a copyright law issue for individual domains, and it's probably worth specifying that I would think that would be out of scope.
Thank you. Yari, you said like you don't think you're puzzled, like sorry to call on you, but I thought it's an interesting point because like we did think it was going to be complicated. So
yes, I'm usually puzzled. But in this particular case, I'm kind of wondering if the complexity really is here. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a logic. We have to combine things, but it's not like there aren't too many ways of doing it. Whereas this sort of the arguments that we might have in this group are probably more to do with the base vocabulary rather than this math-based combination kind of thing. That's how I think about it, but I might be missing something.
Thank you. Thanks, Harry. Martin, go.
Yeah, I think the vocabulary questions are the most important ones, and we don't have any questions about those. I would really like to get some time to discuss some of the more interesting questions there. The ones that I think have come up, at least in discussions with people on the draft that I put up, was, are we talking about gathering for training, gathering for inference time usage, what's the interaction with things like RAG, and the other one was, and now I'm blanking.
I think probably purposes. What are they going to? Are you doing it for foundational models? That kind of thing.
AI thing, I think, is another one that's come up, and there's some differing perspectives on that. Unfortunately, I think we're probably best suited to do that discussion in Brussels, where I think we'll have a few more people who have done some work on that. But maybe some time on that here would be helpful.
Sounds good. I think like we might have a little bit of time to discuss it, like at the end after the drafts or along with the drafts. Yeah, sure. Thanks. Okay. So I think like we ruled out like developing licensing schemes, but allow some extensibility mechanisms that will allow it if somebody wants to go work on it outside the group. This is just to put this in here, like not discussing this, but just say that if you're interested in doing this work somehow, like, please feel free to go find a bunch of people interested in this, work on it, and like bring back your findings to the group, like at some point, but it's probably not something we want to start with. Okay, so stating the obvious, but has to be stated, like, our work is only part of the solution in this case. There's like a lot of like stuff that policymakers need to do. I see Sarah nodding. Yes, like absolutely. And I think it's key for us to communicate this, like what we are working on, and more importantly, what we are not working on to them. And so the idea is like, we kind of ruled out the technical enforcement of preferences out of scope in this working group, but it's something we can probably do later. Like, so I think it's really good to keep the dialogue going between the policymakers and the group to make sure that, like, level set the expectations and just like talk about the limits of the mechanisms that we provide and how they can interact with the policy measures. And like, it's really a question of like managing expectations, and like part of the thing that we're meeting in Brussels is make sure that we get to meet a set of policymakers like who didn't get a chance to participate last time as well. And kind of we want to keep this happening, right? Like, and it'll be very helpful if like, people who are already here in the room get other people in as well. And kind of like, I think you speak a different language at some point, and it'll be good if you can kind of use those things to propagate this further to the other set of people. Yeah, go ahead. Farzaneh, I think you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with you. I think it's very important, especially because the EU AI Act Code of Practice, the third draft, specifically mentions robots.txt and also the exclusion, the bots exclusion protocol, and also any subsequent protocol that is going to be produced by IETF. So I think that it's very important to liaise with them.
Thank you, Farzana. Glenn?
One clarification for when we're meeting in Brussels. Is there going to be a dress code since we're going to be having policymakers in the room?
No, like we don't plan to enforce one as chairs. And if
Awesome.
you're remote, we really cannot enforce it. So
Awesome.
So if you didn't hear it well because of the room audio, like Glenn was asking if there's going to be a dress code in Brussels, and the answer was no. So whatever you're wearing here is good. Probably something warmer because it's probably going to be colder in Brussels. Okay, so we're spilling into the next item. Like, we have a bunch of drafts that are like, I think it's pretty cool that we have a bunch of drafts at this point. And like, mic is open. Really, there's no plan to do anything here, but like, if you have any comments on the drafts, if you want to kind of put your draft up in front of other people, like bring some ideas up, please feel free to go ahead. I see Martin in the room. Martin, do you want to talk something about your draft?
So my draft is simple but not simplistic. Gary's shocked at the fact that it's 17 pages, but when you actually put the IANA considerations in a document, you get some pages. There's examples and algorithms and a bunch of other things. I've specified the combinatorial thing. It is as simple as I could manage. It has an HTTP header and an extension to robots.txt. I think we're really just, Gary and I have both said the same thing on that front. I've identified 4 usages and taken a position on some of the things, but obviously those positions are subject to feedback from everyone. For instance, I took the position that expressing a preference about whether something is good for search or not was useful. That may be something that we don't do. That's certainly something, that's a position that others have taken, and I think is a very reasonable one. The other thing that I've done is I've combined usage and training as the same thing on the basis that it's the usage that people care about. They don't care so much if someone trains a model. It's just whether the model can be used, and so if the model exists, it will be used. So distinguishing between the two of them doesn't make a huge degree of sense to me. Again, others have taken a different position, and I think we should have a debate about that. I've not done all of the other attributes that people say. You can just say yes or no, or say nothing, on the Barnes principle or whatever we call it.
Martha's principle.
Martha's principle. And there's a little bit of hierarchy in there, in that there's a Gen AI thing, and that is a subset of the AI thing, which is again a subset of the TDM thing, which is the broad, using this information in whatever fashion category that's at the top.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it.
So one thing I remember, Martin, was the usage was like more related to the RAG stuff than the training stuff. I think the usage exists in both the cases, but the usage was like not for the purposes of training, but for like answering something more real time, was like how I thought of it. But
right, and so even in that case, this text doesn't distinguish between those two things. It says if you're using it for AI, it's training of a model, use of that model, or use of the content by that model. And there have been some questions about agentic AI and whether that counts as being used by a model or used by a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are very good questions to be asking, and I don't have answers to them, basically.
Perfect, thank you. Gary, do you want to make a spiel about your 2 drafts?
So I haven't touched robots.txt because, well, Martin was touching it anyway. I think robots.txt specifically is just key value pairs associated to a group, which was defined by a user agent field. So it's like, however we want to expand it, should be doable. So I don't have a draft for robots.txt stuff. I do have stuff for the headers, the robots headers. So that was defined originally in in 96-ish, or 98 or something like that. And it's in the experimental space, which I dreamed of moving out of because I hate it. But it will break stuff. So it's not backwards compatible, obviously, because you are changing the key of the header. But if we are changing the key of the header, then we can also change the value to some extent. So basically, change the key to just robots tag, so it still has some backwards compatibility. And then the value that's just not structured headers or structured fields, and that would also support parsing the old format of values, so that the value itself would be backwards compatible, at least to the largest extent. Now, I will admit that I don't remember what Martin introduced for HTTP header in his draft. The what? Different spelling. Okay. But I don't think that we should introduce a new header, like a completely new header, but rather reuse something that is already there, or people are already familiar with the concept, at least. So the second, the rep-ext is redefining the header, and then the purpose, that's just basically spelling out that some of the dictionaries in the structured field in the value could be reused as conveying preferences, AI preferences, and that's it. So simpler than Martin's. Please like it.
Thank you. Tom is not here, but if you have any comments for Tom's draft, like please send over. And I think there's like one more. I think Paul Keller is like working on a draft as well. I think it should be published soon. Like, so I think we sent him over to Martin to work for the Kanban template. And so I think like we should probably have another draft in that space coming up pretty soon. So does anybody have any comments we haven't addressed? Like, really go into the open mic, and I just want to have like a few minutes at the end to talk about Brussels, but mic's open, whatever you want to say. Lucas.
Yeah, I haven't been tracking this work that closely. I do apologize. I've got other colleagues who are, so I'll let them think about all of this stuff. But what I'm hearing a lot is kind of like there's a server and something's coming to scrape data from it, maybe, or whatever. What about like data in the other direction? If I want to post something somewhere to the thing, can I attach my preferences for the data that I'm contributing somewhere? Obviously, a robots.txt wouldn't suit that model, but could I add a header in that direction? I don't want to. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I think good point, Lucas. Right. So this is something that has been discussed on the list as well. So, but I would say content producers, owners, like platforms, people who crawl these things, all of them can express preferences. How they're combined is going to be the bigger question. But it's ideally the design is to have multiple set of people expressing preferences in a chain. Yeah, Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. Robots exclusion works at the server level to say, these are my preferences for everything on the server, more or less. You have an HTTP header field in that protocol that expresses things about particular resources or particular representations, in fact. got to get it right.
Mhm.
The header that I defined isn't attached to that style of declaration, and so it applies to the content of the message. So it applies to that particular representation, not a particular resource necessarily. And so it would work for Lucas's case to the extent that makes sense. I almost called it content something or other in naming it, but decided that the world could use 8 less octets on every one of these things. So that's really all that there is there.
Thank you. Lucas, did that address your question, or did you have something left?
No, thank you very much. Like I said, I need to go and read more, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have any comments? Martin, go ahead.
All right. So there are other questions that we've had that have come up in discussions. Tom's draft has an expiration time on statements of preferences. Maybe this is something that we can resolve here relatively quickly. I know that's maybe a bit unfair on Tom, but I'd like to hear what people have to say about that sort of style of expressing not just not constraints on the usage, but constraints on the constraints. So this preference applies only for the next 10 minutes, and thereafter you're back into the unknown state. Is that a useful thing to have? My conclusion was that it absolutely wasn't, but I'd like to hear from others on that.
It's not clear to me either, Martin, like personally. So I would think, but like, if it's not positively needed, it's out, right? Like that's kind of how we think about it, unless somebody justifies it. Glenn?
Arden, it might be useful in the case of content that's temporarily embargoed and that you want to sunrise. So having that ability might be very useful to some people.
So if you embargo content and you put it in a robots.txt file or otherwise accessible file, then it's not really embargoed.
So you're assuming the content itself is available. So it could be that the robot.txt file information is pre-published along with a pre-published URL that says this URL will light up at this particular time and be available. Until then, it's not available. I'm not saying there's not other ways to do it. I'm just simply responding to, would that be useful? It might be useful.
But then if, oh, I like my hair, oh, nice. So if the URL doesn't exist yet, like it returns 404 or something, or 403, then again, like the embargo is deeper in the protocol, right?
Gary, can you go to the mic and stand at the mic so the camera can follow you? It's freaking out.
Oh.
Just at the mic, it's very hard to come up with all possible scenarios. I'm simply saying that I can see scenarios in which it would be useful. I see your point that embargoed content that is not yet published is like kind of denied. However, if you are trying to pre-plan, if you're the AI crawler, right, and you're trying to pre-plan stuff and you want to pull this stuff, this would give you information ahead of time saying at this particular time it's become sunrise. I'll give, and this is probably a bad analogy, and I'm just making it up as I go, so I may be getting this wrong, so don't be too harsh. But I'll draw an analogy to, there's a strategy in video delivery where you pre-declare the URLs before the content is available, so as to publish them to the edge of the caches. And then you have clients come fetch them, and they go into wait states to pull. There may be an analogy here where that makes sense to apply.
I cannot hear you, Maria. Go to the mic.
She just wants to go through the rest of the queue.
Okay, yeah. Alyssa, go ahead.
So I think one of the motivations for this that we talked about at the workshop was only exists in the context where these these preferences get passed through to different entities in the chain. And I think this is in particular why Common Crawl is interested in this, because people get mad at them about things that they've crawled, but they're actually being used downstream by other projects. So I think that it's worth thinking through that set of use cases, or maybe people don't think that there will be any way to pass these things through. But that, I think in that situation, you can imagine the utility of the temporal restriction a little bit better. Because now it's like someone downstream from the initial crawl is now having to decide, am I allowed to use this for certain purposes or not? And if it only existed, you know, if that preference was only valid for a certain period of time, then you would want that information to also be passed down.
Yeah, good point, Alyssa. And do you think something is needed, Alyssa, that like, you know, where the common crawl probably gets a different set of preferences and different set of things to pass down further?
I don't think it's a different set, but I totally appreciate why they want to be able to pass the things down overall. I think, I don't know, maybe it's not that useful to have this conversation without them here, but my recollection is that there were some motivating use cases for this temporal restriction thing. So we should not dismiss them until we've had the full hearing of what they are.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
But I will say one other thing though, which is this also feels like the kind of thing that if the norm of adhering to it isn't developed, it's just going to be this tag that sits there that everyone knows, like, oh, actually we just ignore this. So developing that, which is not something we can do in a working group, is actually the important thing. And if we think that's going to happen, then we talk about whether we should signal it or not.
Sounds good. Thank you. So Max, like, I don't know if you're going to come to the mic, but I think Alyssa's point is like kind of like keep it pending for now. There's no like accepting or rejecting it yet, but like kind of hear out all the people before we decide. And I'm generally on the same point as like Martin. So try to keep it simple, but let's kind of have the discussion if there's something that we're missing out, right? Like it's kind of what Alyssa was suggesting. Yeah, makes sense. Jonathan?
As Jonathan Pavler. I have a totally speculative use case, which would be, you could imagine some kind of news organization that says, if you pay us money, you can use our news straight away, but if you don't, you have to wait 15 minutes. Like, could be. Like, you can imagine use cases.
Right, and those people, there are some of the people in the room, right? Like, you know, Max, like who's like online, right? Like if you can talk to it, that's fine, right? Like Max, you feel free to, like, you know, I don't know if you heard what Jonathan said, but if it's something that like, you know, you're considering, like, you feel free to speak up. Thanks. Lars.
Lars at Mozilla. So along the lines of what Alyssa said and what you then tried to summarize, I would sort of maybe give it a slightly more aggressive spin and say, unless somebody can really describe a use case that's compelling and that is worked out to the level of detail where we can agree that, yeah, we want to support this, we can leave it in for now until this has happened. But if it isn't happening within some period of time, it needs to go, because as Alyssa said, otherwise it's just this wart that's sitting there. And let's be honest, this is already complicated enough as a space, right? So if there's a chance to keep the temporal out of it, I think this would be a very good thing.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. So you're saying make it temporal and then it'll expire and then we remove that from
Put something in the draft that says, somebody needs to explain a use case for us by give, this year or whatever. Pick a number.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks. Sarah, do you want to make a point at the mic? Or I think Max is up next, like, to respond to Jonathan's point. Then you can go after. Max, go.
Yeah, I'll try to be lucid. The main thing I want to say, right, is that if in use cases where publishers tend to say, hey, we're going to give you X access to this kind of content, but there's some sort of timing issue, or you only get it under certain cases, that's not generally done through open feeds. You build an API and the partner accesses it directly. I'm not going to say that that's the case for every single situation, because there's lots of publishers and we all act differently. But that is what most publishers are moving towards. So that particular use case doesn't make sense. And if what I said didn't make sense, please ask me at a time that is more normal for me. Thank you.
Thanks. Sarah?
My suggestion as to why there might be some kind of time element was about RAG and like news, that you might want contemporaneous information if you're asking a question and then there's a sort of reputational risk of pulling something up that's relatively out of date. So you might want control over that, but then also non-news publisher. So.
Thank you. So I think we've exhausted the queue. We do have a couple of minutes, but I'll just talk about the Brussels interim. So we did circulate these details and ask for like pre-registration for this. Unfortunately, this is a fact of like meeting room space. So we did have like limited space. So we asked people to pre-register if you're going to be there physically. And thanks to Microsoft for providing the meeting space for us. Like Fabrice did the magic for us. And the announcement is linked out here. And remote participation will be available. So we will make sure that like this is going to be a regular IETF Meet Echo participation that will be made available. So feel free to participate in the meeting. And we will finalize the agenda based on like Mark and I, when Mark is back up, to make sure that we talk about like what happened in this meeting and try to circulate the initial agenda before so we can be prepared. So we don't have much time. We have like 2 weeks barely. So I think we'll get on it and start like affirming of the agenda for the meeting. And if you have any questions about the logistics for this, feel free to like talk to us. And if you just hear about the physical meeting and you want to be there, like kind of talk to Mark and me, and we'll see if we can accommodate based on the numbers we have there. Thanks. So any final comments from anybody before we close? Thank you. Martin, is there anything you wanted to bring up based on the RAG discussion that's happening on the chat?
How much time we got? So there's a bunch of discussions on the chat about RAG. It seems like at least some people are concerned that it would be interesting to separate out the use for the purposes of training and the use specifically during the generation phase of obtaining the content and using it in that context. It's totally possible. The draft that I wrote is extensible and describes all the considerations you need to have for that. I think that's probably true of some of the other proposals as well. I think that's just another point in the space that we can talk about when we meet next. I think giving it 10 minutes probably isn't going to give it the time it deserves.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks all. And with that, we've reached the end of the things we wanted to discuss. So thank you very much for attending the first meeting of this group. And please stay involved on the mailing list and on the interim meeting if you're possible to attend based on your time zone. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you all again. Thanks a lot. You get like 7 minutes back to get a coffee. Thank you.